I am very excited about today. I adore Mitch. When you guys hear him, he's one of the most amazing people that I know. So smart, so talented. I'll get into him in 1 second, but I just want to very quickly let you guys know about us and why we're doing this, and a little bit more about what we're thinking for the next year. So welcome to our Envision Consulting webinar on the fundamentals of nonprofit governance. We are a national firm. We actually just opened up an office in Denver. So we have offices in Denver, New York, and LA, and we only work with nonprofits. So we are about half strategy and half search. So what that means is that if you're at a nonprofit and you need to do a strategic plan, you need to do a board retreat, maybe you want to quit and you want somebody to take your place, that's what we do. Strategy and search, only for nonprofits across the country. And very proud of us. We're a team of 12 and we are just, if I say so myself, pretty amazing. So that's one thing. The other thing I want you guys to know about is that this is a webinar on governance, and it's a really timely webinar because next week, next Thursday, we are hosting our very first after COVID in-person Cause Cupid happy hour. The last one we did was in New York in 2019, and so excited to do this again. So if you don't know what Cause Cupid is, it is a happy hour event where we bring together about 20 nonprofits and up to 50 people who want to join a board of directors. And so again, it's next Thursday at 5 o'clock. If you are interested in attending, if you are interested in becoming a board member, or if you're a nonprofit that's interested in getting board members, I will tell you though that we are now at a wait list for nonprofits. In the chat, you will see the link. If you want to sign up, we are not full yet for board members. We're getting very close. So I would ask for you to just sign up as quickly as you can. It's a free event, and it's just a really phenomenal way to learn about nonprofits in LA. We have a ton of people who are always asking us, hey, what does it mean to be a board member? How do I join a board? How do I find nonprofits? That's next week. And by the way, that's today. So that's just really important. The other thing I'll let you know is that we're going to be starting a new offering for board development. So be on the lookout for that. If you haven't signed up for our newsletter, please do. We will share all that information as we continue over the next few weeks. So let me tell you about Mitch, who's one of my favorites. So just so you know, he started his career as 26 years in the Air Force. And then after that was 20 years as a CEO. And for the last 11 years, he's been a consultant. He was the CEO of the Pasadena Tournament of Roses, which is actually how we know him. And then prior to that, he was at Claremont. And like I said, prior to that, he was in the Air Force. And for now, he's doing 11 years of consulting. Just an amazing guy. So smart. Makes me, every time I listen to him or introduce him, I always feel so stupid, but just such a great guy. And I'm going to just tell you really quickly about housekeeping, and then I'm going to start the presentation. So this is an hour-long presentation from Mitch, and there'll be 15 minutes at the end for you guys to ask questions. In the middle of this, I'm going to try really hard not to interrupt Mitch, but if anybody has any such a dying question that it cannot wait, please just put it into chat. And then if I think it's that important, I will interrupt Mitch, but I don't want to do that. He doesn't want me to do that. But definitely put them into chat, and then I'll have them when we have 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. And with that, I'm going to spotlight Mitch so that you guys will not see any of us, and just Mitch. And then the other thing I just want to let you know is this is being recorded. We're going to be doing about 12 to 24 of these over the next year, and each one will be recorded. So that's just really important for you guys to know. And Mitch, and I love right now he's wearing those what is it, the big earphones that I feel like you're flying that airplane. So anyway, Mitch, you are up, and I'm going to spotlight you.
Okay, well, I thank you. Matt, it's good to be with you all today. It's good, and it's good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. We have people with us today from as far away as Texas, New York, and even for 2 countries in Africa. So I think that the turnout for today is awesome, and I hope that everybody enjoys this and gets something out of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the fundamentals of nonprofit governance. And most of us know what fundamentals means and what nonprofit means. But I want to talk a little bit about what governance means. There are two words that have to do with running of nonprofits. One is governance and one is management. And to those people that are new to the business, they think that those mean the same things. In fact, they don't. They're not the same, but they're both essential. Governance has to do with the higher level strategic functions that drive the actions of management. So governance figures out where the organization is going, what the goals are, and that sort of thing, passes them on to management, who then carries them out. So here's a little bit of a demonstration of what governance does. And governance is the purview of the board of directors. The staff is not involved in governance. The board does things like strategic direction, policy development, etc. And the executive director and the staff carry those out in terms of program planning and execution and administration and everything. In addition, the staff and management has to provide some support to the board in order for them to carry on their functions effectively. So that's the difference between governance and management. And today we're not going to talk about management. That's a whole different subject. We're going to talk about governance and the role of the board. So what is a board of directors? Well, if you were to look it up in the dictionary, what it would tell you is that it's a group of selected individuals legally charged with representing the interests of the corporation's owners. Well, that's all well and good, but we're in the nonprofit world and we don't have owners. What we have is the public. And by law, we nonprofits serve the public interest. That's why the government is willing to allow us not to pay income taxes, is because we are performing a worthwhile service that serves the public in general. The law also tells us that the buck stops with the board of directors. That's where the ultimate authority is, and that's where the legal accountability is. And at this point, I always say to people, well, who cares? Who says? And the answer is the California Corporation Code. And for those of you that are not still in California, your state will provide some sort of nonprofit corporation code. And so you'll want to look in there, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be the same as California, which says that the ultimate authority and the legal accountability rests with the board of directors and not with management. Interestingly, when you deal with a board, you have multiple people. You have a minimum of 3 people, and there is no maximum. The average nonprofit board runs about 14 people. The average for-profit board, just as a comparison, runs about 11 people. So when boards act, they do so collectively. The power that the law imbues the board with only comes when it takes group action. No one individual has any powers unless the board has granted those special authorities in bylaws or in board resolutions, which give people authority to do certain things. And those are not uncommon. You'll frequently find where the bylaws will say what a board president does or what the treasurer does, etc. But as a general rule, power comes only from group action and not from individual whims of board members. Board members are legally considered fiduciaries. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with that term, fiduciaries stands for a standard of care that is one of the highest standards of care of other people's resources. And basically what it says is that board members have to treat the resources in the organization as well and as effectively as they would take care of their own resources and activities. So fiduciary is a very high standard of care. And if it's violated, the attorneys general of the various states and the IRS keep an eye on nonprofits, and there can be penalties. For example, there may be financial penalties. I am aware of nonprofit board members who have had to make up shortfalls in the income taxes and the human resources taxes. And there's also reputational. If you're on a board and the board goes out of business or is fined or gets in the newspaper for something bad, it can reflect adversely on you as an individual. So you want to remember that you're a fiduciary. There are possible penalties, but if you carry out your responsibilities correctly, you won't have any problems with the Attorney General or the IRS. Back when I was first considering becoming a consultant, I talked to an experienced consultant who basically said, if you've seen one nonprofit board, you've seen one nonprofit board. And the point that they were trying to make is that no two boards are exactly alike. They're different sizes. They perform basically the same roles and responsibilities, but they may do it in slightly different ways. What happens is that the organization needs to take a hard look at what it needs to do business, and then that will drive the boards to adopt particular organizations and responsibilities and those sort of a thing. So the point is, if you've been on a nonprofit board in the past and you go someplace to join another one, don't necessarily expect it to look and operate exactly the same way that your last one did. Boards tend to operate along a continuum. And a fellow by the name of John Carver, who's written several books about nonprofit governance, talks about 3 different types of boards. At the low end, you have what they call a work group board. A work group board means that the work of the organization is done by the board. They're very small. Many of them are startup organizations. Many of them have little resources. And so the work of the organization is done by the board itself. So that's one type of board. At the other end of the perspective, there's a policy board, which you would normally see in very large nonprofits, universities, hospitals, that sort of thing, where the board doesn't get involved in operations at all. It strictly deals with the policies and the strategic direction. And in between there, Carver says there's something that's called a line board. And a line board retains some executive authority for some reason. And we'll talk about that. So your particular board structure and the operations will depend on a number of things. It depends on the organizational size and financials. Can you afford a staff, et cetera, or does the board have to do things? The staff size and expertise. You may have only one executive director as the staff, or maybe an operations manager and a CEO. But it all depends on the board functions, depend on how large the staff is and how good the staff is at their particular functions. Finally, it depends upon things like the organizational identity. Matt mentioned to you all that I used to be the CEO of the Tournament of Roses. The Tournament of Roses is a huge volunteer organization that puts on the Rose Parade and the Rose Bowl football game, as well as a number of other smaller tasks every year. The brand of the Tournament of Roses is that it is volunteer run. And so the tournament will always be some kind of a line board and will retain some of the operational decisions themselves, as opposed to turning that over to staff. So there's a board continuum, and depending upon the size of the staff, the nature of the organization, et cetera, your board may fall in one of these 3 categories or somewhere in between. All right, so now we've taken a quick look at the generalities. What's the role of the board? How do we define that group of people sitting up above in the picture there? What are the things that they're supposed to be doing? Well, the board performs 2 major functions. Broadly speaking, they're there to prevent harm to the organization from the outside or even the inside. And they're also there to help maximize the value to society of the organization. And they do these 2 functions by carrying out a series of 10 basic responsibilities. These are defined by an organization called BoardSource, which, if you're not familiar with it, is one of the best sources of information regarding nonprofits in the country. And they have a book, which is here. I don't know if you can see it there, probably not. It's called 10 Basic Responsibilities of Nonprofit Boards. It's an excellent short book. And it talks about each of these. And that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to take these 10 basic responsibilities and I'm going to peel back the onion a little bit and tell you what each one means. So the first is for the board to define its mission and purpose. The first thing that you need to know is that the mission itself is a statement of purpose. Too many nonprofits come on and they give you their mission in terms of their activity. So for example, let's say you are in an organization that provides free legal services to underserved communities. You may say, well, the mission is to provide free legal services, but that's an activity. What your real purpose is to enhance social justice by providing a particular service. You see the difference? One is a statement of purpose and one is a statement just of activity. You want to say the statement of purpose because you want it to be motivational for your board members, your staff members, your beneficiaries. It's a motivational thing, and your mission should be the basis for everything the organization does. Before you ever consider anything, you should take a look at the mission and say, how does this proposal that we're considering today move our mission forward? And does it help or hurt in our ultimate purpose? The board also needs to establish a vision. This may be the most important thing that the board does, although you'll see something later that says something else is the most important. But you need to have a vision. The vision is, where is this organization going? Where would it like to be in the future? And that vision, which should look 5 to 10 years down the road, should stretch the organization. There's a fellow by the name of Jim Collins, who I'll quote a little bit more later. Jim Collins wrote a book called Good to Great with regard to management, and many of you may be familiar with that. But basically what Jim Collins says is, as soon as you as an organization become satisfied with where you are, you've already started the downhill run. And so what you want to do is you want to continually seek to improve, and the vision should reflect that in terms of stretching the organization to inspire you all for the future. That vision needs to be realistic. It needs to have a specific timeline, and preferably one that's not 20 or 25 years down the road. You want the time horizon to be part of the motivation to get things done. So give them a reasonable time frame, but not a forever time frame to get things done. And your vision needs to periodically be reviewed and revised. For example, there are many nonprofits over time which have changed their mission and vision based upon the circumstances of the world at the time. For example, many of you will remember that the March of Dimes originally started out as looking for a cure and a prevention for polio. When we were able to almost totally eradicate polio, they moved their mission and expanded it to cover birth defects as well. Who knows what's going to happen now, since we're having a resurgence in some areas of polio. But needless to say, the point there is that missions and vision can change over time if your circumstances change. The next thing, once you have established a vision and mission for the board, you want to build a board. And normally this is a very complex topic, and it's normally a special separate presentation. But I'm going to throw it in today and at least lightly touch on what it takes to build a competent and effective board. It's a multi-step process, and we'll go into each one of these as we go along. The first one, here's Jim Collins again. He says, get the right people on the bus. And if you look over at the blue box phrase, it says, a board is a team comprised of individual board members, each with different but valuable abilities. So you want not only great people to be on your board, but you want to help choose them based upon their differences and their abilities. And to do this, you need to understand the needs of the board itself and to recruit board members with purpose in mind. And this is a tool that you can use to help. This is called a board development matrix. And the way it's built is you list your members across the top, and you need the skills, abilities, or attributes that you think you need along the left side. and then you go in and you evaluate. For example, in this case, we find that members 1 and member 3 have what we've defined as skill 1. And so you fill this out for your whole board. And at the end, if you've done this properly, you will end up with a picture of what you need to recruit for your next particular board member. So in this particular example, skill 3 has nobody on the board that has that particular skill. So we would be looking for a new board member that would have that skill. So you see how that fits in to figuring out what the board needs to operate, and then how you recruit to fill that board out to carry out your mission. Then you want, once you've got the right people there, you want to tell them what they're supposed to do. You need something like this presentation so that the board understands its roles, or it can be in a written document. And it's very important that you do this, not only for the board, but for the staff. I have seen board members who join boards and then several weeks or months into their whole relationship, they said, you know, I've been on the board for 2 months and I still don't know what the heck we're supposed to be doing. So you want to make sure your board members know what they're doing, and you want to make sure that the staff members know. Staff members tend not to be aware necessarily of what the board is, or what it does, or what the relationship between the board and staff are. This is something that requires a lot of attention. I once gave a seminar, and at the end, I had a woman raise her hand and tell me that the only function of the board in her organization was to write checks so that she could run the organization. And I told her, well, you know, that's not really what the law says. And we went into that. But don't assume that the staff members understand the board and its roles or its authorities. So make sure you train both the board and the staff in their responsibilities. So now they know what they're supposed to be doing. The next thing we want them to do is to organize well. And the first thing you want to do is to right size your board. This is the most common question that everybody asks. How big should my board be? The answer to that is a very legalistic approach, and it says, it depends. It depends on the work of the board. And so what you want to do is you want to figure out how many people it takes to do the work of the board. Normally, that'll be somewhere between 10 and 12, and we'll talk a little bit about how you determine that. Then once you've determined the size of the board and you've recruited the people, you want to have the right officers. The law requires that you have 3 officers, a president, a treasurer, and a secretary. Now, it may turn out that you want the same person to be the secretary and treasurer. That's okay. But you can't have the president also fill one of those other 2 responsibilities. I think 3 people is too small. I like to recommend that you have a couple of others. The first one I recommend is that you have a president-elect or a vice chair to the board. This is the person that's going to take over eventually from the current board chair or board president. And I think it's good to have them in on all the decisions and all the operations so that when they take their turn in the number 1 chair, they're ready to go. You may also want to consider keeping the immediate past president on the board to provide a historical perspective and to help the new board president as he or she comes on. So you may want to have 5 to 6 officers, but you don't want to have too many. You don't want to just create titles for no particular purpose at all. And I've certainly run into that where they've defined officers as having no real duties, and you don't want to do that. The next thing that you want to do is you want to create committees. And I'm going to say up front that I believe that the most effective boards are those where the bulk of the stubby pencil work and the critical initial thinking on proposals takes place in committees and not in the full board. The full board is not equipped to take on all of those in the limited time that it has. So what I recommend is that the board create a certain number of committees to help it carry out its responsibilities, and that the stubby pencil work be done in committees. The other thing that I want to talk about is the difference between a board committee and an operating committee. A board committee has a continuing function related to the governance of the organization. And I've listed a few here above the dotted line that would show you the type of typical board committees that you might find in a moderately sized nonprofit. Below the dotted line are your operating committees. These are the people that are actually carrying out the tasks. And a good example of an operating committee might be the group of people that you pull together to put on your annual fundraising gala or to carry out a particular event. So those would be operating committees. A good example of those is in the Tournament of Roses. The Tournament of Roses has 33 different operating committees, which actually carry out the work of the organization, but they're not in the governance business, they're in the operations business. And so I want you to be aware of the two types of committees. Here are, in a typical nonprofit, the type of committees that you'll find. You'll normally find an executive committee, although these are becoming less and less prevalent. But an executive committee, which was originally created so that there could be management decisions when the full board couldn't be brought together, normally consists of the officers of the corporation and the key committee chairs. But as I said, these are going out of favor because with Zoom and other Google Meet, other things like that, it's easy to get people together electronically. So you may not need this committee that's designed for nothing more than to make decisions when the full board can't be convened. You might have a governance and or a nominating committee. These are the people that are focusing in on board training, bylaws, new board members, board evaluations, all of these sort of things. It's a big job, and not as many organizations as should have moved away from nominating towards the broader governance. You'll normally find a finance committee who looks out after the finances and expenditures of the organization. You may or may not have an audit committee. Every state and country has their own requirements for when you need an audit committee. The federal government says if you make over $2 million a year as a nonprofit, you're required to have an audit committee and perform a full audit every year. California has some additional requirements. So what you want to do is you want to do your research to determine whether you need an audit committee or not. It's a very important committee, but sometimes you're not required to have one. Development committee. For folks that aren't familiar with the term, development in the nonprofit sense is fundraising. Okay, so the development committee are those that run the fundraising program for the organization. Now, depending upon the size and sophistication and needs of the organization, you may have other committees. For example, if you have money in the bank, you may want to have an investment committee to help manage those reserve funds. You may want to have a marketing committee to enhance the brand. You may, if you're a membership association, you may want to have a membership committee to deal with your policies related to your members. And you may have one dealing with community relations and communications. There's no list of approved committees. There's no magic list. Again, committees are created to carry out the work of the board, and the board itself decides what committees there needs to be to help it do its work. And then what you want to do is you want to thoroughly prepare your board members. Not only do they need to know what the responsibilities are, but there's a lot of other things that new board members need to know. They need to know about legalities. The law requires 3 duties of all board members. We talked about being a fiduciary earlier. They also have legal duties of care, which is very much what a fiduciary does. Loyalty, which says that you need to put the needs of the organization ahead of even your own. And obedience, which basically says you got to obey your own laws and the laws of the land. So those are legalities that exist that board members are required by law to do. There are other legalities associated that people need to understand. These are things like if a donor gives you money for a particular purpose, you can only use it for that particular purpose. That's called restricted funds. It's illegal to spend that money for things that the donor did not give them to you for. Nonprofits are not allowed to become politically active in political campaigns. There's a host of these other legalities that you need to train your board members on. Then you need to tell your new board members, what are they expected to do? How much involvement do they need to have? What's their code of conduct for board meetings? How much time is it going to take? Financially, are they going to be required to contribute to the organization? Are they going to be required to fundraise? What financial aspects are there to it? A lot of organizations have what they call give or get, which means that particular board member either needs to write a check for the organization, a certain amount, or they need to go to their friends and raise that money. And finally, you need to tell them, if you're going to have an evaluation process, they need to know whether they're going to be evaluated at the end of the year. So tell them what the expectations are for the organization. I often find that good nonprofits have a 1-page or 2-page document that lays out these expectations, and board members are asked to sign that to indicate that they understand and will comply with the expectations. The next thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that they're aware of the organization. And so you want to have an onboarding or an orientation process. And here's some of the things that you want to talk to them about. You want to provide them the documents that talk about the mission, the bylaws, the structure, who are the key players in the organization, what's the budget look like, what's the last year's financial statements, what are recent minutes, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to tell them, you want to provide them the key documents, you want to make sure that they understand what your activities are, what your goals are, and how your activities carry out those goals. And you want to tell them what's the current issues. Don't make them come on board and sit there for a year before they know what the issues are that they're supposed to be working on. And then you want to keep the board energized and revitalized. So size the board to meet the workload. Don't overload the board with a lot of duties or they'll burn out. Have committees do most of the work. You want to streamline the board meeting. Focus on critical matters so people know and understand that what they're doing is important and meaningful. So don't make them just come and listen to purely informational matters. And there's a thing called a consent agenda, which you can use, which basically assigns all purely informational or routine decisions to one particular agenda item, and they can pass all of those. And it's too complicated to get into that right now. But if you're interested in making your board meetings more efficient and effective, look into the content of a consent agenda. And watch for board member burnout. And more boards are considering term limits. You know, human beings can get tired of what they're doing. And so you want to look and see if those people that have been on the board for a while are maybe burning out a little. They're not as active, or they're not raising as much money, or they're not as interested. They don't show up. So you may want to consider term limits for your board members in the future. So that's how you build and maintain a board. And I apologize, that was very quick, but that's a whole separate presentation, as I mentioned. So the next thing you want to do is select and support the chief executive. And I'm assuming there that your staff is large enough to have a chief executive. So a good friend of mine who's an attorney here in Pasadena, who was one of my bosses at the Tournament of Roses, he said the most important responsibility of any board is the selection of the chief executive officer. And you do that by having a good process to select those people. Matt talked to you earlier about Envision. Envision is one of the best around to helping you figure out what the needs of the organization are, and then finding the right people to help recruit those people. So you want to determine what you need, then get the right people to apply. And once you've got a bunch of candidates, you want to ask them tough questions. Make sure that you don't leave important questions that you have in mind unasked. and you want to evaluate the cultural fit. Does this person that you're interviewing fit in culturally with the organization? I know of one organization which was strongly nonprofit and very nonprofit motivated, but they thought that they needed somebody from the for-profit world to come in to help them raise future money. The cultural fit was terrible. The person coming in knew the for-profit world, but didn't understand the nonprofit world. And they ended up separating and parting ways after only about a year. So you want to make sure that there's a good cultural fit before you hire somebody. And again, Envision does this superbly. Now, once you get one as chief executive, you want to support the chief executive. That doesn't mean being a rubber stamp for that person. Not at all. What you want to do is you want to govern and not manage. You want to delegate authorities, establish the right environment for dialogue. And what that means is if you're not particularly happy with the chief executive, you need to have a dialogue to get them back onto track. Or if the chief executive feels like they're not getting enough guidance from the board, that's an adjustment the board needs to make. And finally, as a board member, do not get between the chief executive and the staff. That's one of the worst things that any board member can do. And I used to have a one board president that used to run down the hall and he'd stop in every office and give people instructions when he had no right to be doing that. And I spent half of my time trying to figure out who was supposed to be doing what because he was violating that rule. So you're required as a board member to exercise independent judgment. That's a legal requirement. But that doesn't mean you have to do all the work yourself. You can have the staff advise you, you can have outside experts advise you, but you have to maintain your own separation from the proposals of the management and make sure that you're exercising your independent judgment. And you need to have an atmosphere where, as I mentioned earlier, you can air differences or alternative opinions are welcome. Very important. You're also responsible for ensuring legal and ethical integrity in the organization. Best practices here are you need to have and keep the need for ethics and integrity at the very forefront. Talk about it. Make people understand. People that are going to come to you and donate money, donors, sponsors, and that sort of thing, they want to know that ethics, integrity, and transparency are important values for the organization. So you as a board need to make sure that applies. You need to develop the right policies for management and then to monitor that they're being followed. And then the board should also be involved in ensuring compliance with all laws, federal, state, local, whatever they are, and regulations, say from the IRS. The next responsibility for the board that we talked about was effective planning. And what we're basically talking about here is establishing the strategic direction for the organization. The board needs to understand that that's their job. And they need to not only look at what's going on now, but they need to keep an eye down the road. And they do this by strategic planning process. That's a board responsibility for making sure it happens. Now, you may have staff members involved, but it's the board's responsibility to make sure strategic planning takes place and is done well. And then once you have your strategic plan and your strategic direction, the board needs to keep an eye on things to make sure that you're operating on plan and that you're moving towards the goals that you want to move towards. The next requirement is to monitor and strengthen the programs and services. Now, I just told you a little earlier that we don't want the board messed up in management. So what do we really want to do? We want to provide oversight without managing. And there's basically two ways of doing this. The first is before the fact. And how you do this is the board establishes policies about how things will be done in the organization. And they also establish the goals and objectives and timelines. So that's how you provide oversight before the fact. You let management know what the expectations are. And then after the fact, you want to get reports, evaluations, and independent analysis. You want an outside accountant to come in or an outside audit agency or you might want to have an expert in your functional area come in and take a look at how you are. And how are the reports coming in? Are you doing well? Are you doing badly? Are there problems? And you want these reports to come in a timely manner so that they meet your needs. And you want to evaluate the performances of 3 areas. One, you want to take a look at the organization itself. How are our goals? Are they still timely? What programs do we have? How are those programs being run? And are we making progress towards our goal? The board also has the responsibility every year for evaluating the chief executive officer and providing that chief executive officer feedback on how they're doing and whether any improvements are needed in their performance. It's very hard for people to do this, but it's essential. Looking at it from a CEO perspective, which I did for 20 years, you really need as a CEO this feedback, whether it's positive, negative, or whatever. You want to hear what the board thinks. And finally, you want to evaluate the board itself, both as a group and as individuals. Are we as a board meeting our work plan? Are we getting everything done that we need to get done? And are all board members participating as they should? Or are you having problems with individuals that are burned out and slacking in their performance? You may need to do individual board evaluations as well as group evaluation. The next requirement for the board is to ensure adequate resources. Sustainability here is the goal. I don't know whether you've heard this number before, but 30% of all nonprofits go out of business within the first 10 years of operation. If you translate that in terms of annual requirements, about 40,000 nonprofits go defunct around the country every year. And part of the problem with there is that they don't have the right resources, the right people, the right money, the right facilities, etc. Those are the things that the board needs to help take care of. You need to understand what resources are. Where do you get them? What's the current status? What does the future look like? Let's say you've got a grant from a particular foundation, and that foundation will only provide funds for a 3-year period. Well, you can't rely on that more than 3 years down the road. So then you got to find something to replace those source of funds. So understand the resources. Where do they come from? How do they look like? And what's the future there? And if you can, if you have the luxury of diversifying your financial revenues, that's a good thing. That way you don't have to rely on any one particular source for your revenues. Let's say, for example, you get most of your money from the state of California. Well, if the state of California runs into financial problems, or there's a political change in the state, it may be that your financial support gets cut back. So if that happens, you need to look elsewhere to try to fill in those gaps. And maybe that means starting a fundraising program. And then you need to set your priorities for expenditures. A lot of people, if they have to take financial cuts, what they want to do is what I call salami slice. If they need to take a 10% budget cut, they want to go into programs and take 10% off of every program. That is absolutely the wrong way to do that. What you want to do is figure out your most important programs, fully fund your most important programs, and maybe put a pause on some of your lesser important ones until you make it through your financial difficulty. And when you need to, your boards may have to participate in the fundraising process. This doesn't apply to all boards, all nonprofits, only those which require philanthropy to help raise the right amount of money. Inside the boardroom, you need to understand the needs of the organization and then help craft a compelling case statement that you can give to donors or to foundations or to corporations to help them understand why you need money. And then the board oversees the work of the development staff and how much progress they're making towards the goals of the year. Outside the boardroom, you may be actively involved in the development process. You may be identifying potential donors. You may be making phone calls to open the door. You may be making asks on behalf of the organization. There's all kinds of things outside the boardroom that board members may be responsible for. The next responsibility is to protect assets and provide financial oversight. What are you trying to prevent? You're trying to prevent what I call financial shenanigans. And I will tell you that not a month goes by that I don't find one of these listed shenanigans in the paper with some sort of nonprofit attached to it. Fraud. 15% of all the fraud in America takes place in nonprofit organizations. And sometimes it's not big, and sometimes it's huge. So watch out for fraud. Don't let board members or staff members have excessive or lavish benefits. Don't use restricted funds for purposes other than what the donor intended for. Watch out for unpaid taxes, particularly the employment taxes. So watch out for these kind of shenanigans. And here's your best practices. First of all, you have to have that atmosphere of ethics and openness that I talked about earlier. Critical. The current buzzword is transparency. Make sure that nobody is hiding the financials and nobody's hiding the stuff that they're doing. So you want an open atmosphere of ethics and transparency. It helps to have a financially literate board. And if you don't have a financially literate board, you can either recruit new board members that understand the finances, or you can do the right sort of training for the board members. I have 2 presentations that I give that are designed to do nothing more than to make the board literate about the finances of your organization. You need a good accounting system. There are some accounting systems that are not very robust, and all they do is basically add up your expenditures. But you want a good accounting system that's well known, that's understood, and has capabilities other than just tracking your expenses. It gives you some analysis capability. Engaged finance and audit committees are absolutely critical. They are what's going to prevent the organization from getting the wool pulled over their eyes by a staff member who may or may not have the best interests of the organization at heart. You want to have strong internal controls. For those of you that have not heard this term before, that doesn't mean the thermostat on the wall for your internal controls. It means, what are the rules of how you handle your money? Who accepts money? Who deposits it? Who does your bank reconciliations? Who does your expenditure control? These are internal controls, and your finance and audit committees should build those. And if they have problems building them, you should consult with your accountant or your auditors to help you build the right set of internal controls. And then you need to know about nonprofit rules. Things like you can't contribute to political campaigns. That's an example of protecting the assets of the organization. You also need to manage the risk. Every organization faces financial risk, and there are 2 types here. There's strategic and operational. Strategic risk is external to the organization. These relate to the community you live in, your external sponsors, your donors, what's happening around you that might strategically impact the operation of the organization down the road. The second type is operational. Operational is your tripping and falling hazards, your active shooter policies, whatever it might be, happens internal to the organization that manages the risk of the organization. And then once you know what the risks are, you either need to work to eliminate them or mitigate them. For example, through an insurance policy. That's what insurance is. It is a mitigation of risk. And organizations need to look very closely at what insurance policies they have and what they need to mitigate your risk. And I will tell you that it's more than a liability or auto policy. There are quite a few that you need to be aware of. And I highly recommend that the board either have a risk management committee or they have an insurance broker that can advise them on what's the current state of risk and what insurance can help mitigate it. And finally, as a board member, you're required to enhance the organization's public standing and its brand. Now, what does that mean? Well, the first thing you want to do is you want to find out what the organization's story is. You want to know what the key message points are. And then when you're outside the organization, be effective. Talk to your friends, relatives, people you meet, tell the organization's story, carry out the key message points. Don't make your board go out there and create their own stories. This is sort of the staff responsibility. When I was at the Tournament of Roses, I built a little handout, a trifold handout that had all of the key message points in. And we handed it out to all of our members and said, if you're ever outside the organization, talking about the organization, here's the key points that you want to make. The other thing that you want to do is, in general, you want to advocate for your organization. Now, this is a fairly complex topic because you can't lobby per se, but you can advocate for your organization on a factual basis. I want to make you aware of this, but I also want to tell you at the same time, it's a very complicated subject and it's becoming more and more important. So if you are on a board or a staff member supporting a board, make sure that everybody understands the advocacy rules. And if you don't know where to find those, go online and Google nonprofit advocacy rules and restrictions, and you'll be able to read it. There's all kinds of sources. So you want to enhance the public standing and the brand, but you can't overstep the advocacy rules. And finally, I find it very helpful for organizations to periodically check with their stakeholders. The brand that you perceive inside the boardroom may not be the same as your beneficiaries or the public sees from outside the organization. We did a nationwide study when I was at the Tournament of Roses. We asked all the people around the country if they watched the Rose Parade or if they didn't. And then if they did, why? If they didn't, why? We found out an enormous amount of things. And a lot of it were things that ran exactly opposite to our own self-perceptions. So as a board member, sometimes you need to look outside the organization or have management look outside the organization to figure out what your stakeholders, how they perceive you, and what sort of things that you need to do to ensure that people are seeing you in the proper way. And I thank you all for your patience today. And I wonder if there are any questions out there that anybody might like to ask. I know we went through some of these topics very, very quickly.
By the way, Mitch, you did, as I think I told everybody, Mitch, you're amazing. You did it in exactly the right time too. And just thank you. Thank you for being so spectacular and for doing this. That was a really helpful presentation. I loved it. Okay, so I'm gonna moderate you guys. If I can see some hands, if anybody has any questions, that would be great. And then I'll unmute you.
If people have comments that they'd like to make, that's fine too.
Yep.
Questions or comments or discussions, if there's something that they'd like to discuss within the group.
Or if anybody just wants to say how amazing Mitch is, or how fabulous I am. I'll take that. I'll take that all day.
Or just go, oh my God, I had no idea.
All right, Kathy, I see your hand.
Hi, I'm working with a very small nonprofit that has been basically doing a gala year over year, and they hired me to kind of do something different, like the gala plus grant writing, plus this, plus that, right? To actually raise more serious money for the entity that we are benefiting. And right now, my entire board is a bunch of lawyers, which is great. Except that what we need is like diversity on so many levels.
Amen.
Like, I mean, they're just like beginning to wrap their heads around that, because it used to just mostly be a bunch of white guys and some white women. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. But the diversity I'm looking to add now in terms of skill sets, because I'm the only staff, I'm a consultant, but I'm 25 hours a week, right? So I created a committee structure, and they didn't even have a mission statement when I said, okay, like we're starting, like, and the organization's almost 20 years old, right? So just shoot me now. But what I'm wondering is, I need an accountant. I want some people with some media, some marketing, like, how do I recruit board members is kind of where I'm at. Like, as I'm putting, like, we just got a governance committee. So we're trying
Good for you. Trust me, I feel your pain, because I've worked with organizations like that. And I often find, or I occasionally find, boards who feel like they need to have technical expertise rather than a diversification. And that's not what I recommend. I have run across, for example, I worked with a board that was doing psychological counseling, and their board member consisted almost exclusively of psychologists. Well, then questions would be raised in the board meeting. Well, how do we get money? Is that legal? Those sort of things. Nobody has any idea, because you don't have the right sort of expertise. So what you want to do, Kathy, is you want to sit down with your board chair, and you want to say, what do we need to carry out the board's job? And what do we have now? And what do we need to come up with? Now, I think Matt mentioned it a little earlier. Matt, you guys are going to get into the business of helping people find the right board members, right?
Yeah. So yeah, exactly.
So don't hesitate. Matt Kamen is a guy that knows everybody in the local area down here, and he is a fantastic person for helping to find resources to help your board. So I'm not trying to put a monkey on your back there, Matt, but you do a fabulous job, and you've got this Cause Cupid program that's exactly for that particular purpose. And so, Kathy, if you're not signed up for that next Cause Cupid, get on that list.
It's full now, and I did say that I want to be on it for the next one. But in the interim, I'm just kind of wondering whether, getting my board members to like work their LinkedIn lists, or just kind of get beyond like their little like, oh, here's another lawyer, here's another, like.
Well, I think the first step, this is my opinion, in my first step, I would talk with either the board chair or the officers of the board, and I would try to create them to be champions for diversification. So, they need something like this presentation, or something that you might put together, to tell them how important the diversification of skills and abilities are on the board, and why diversity, and I don't just mean ethnic or heritage diversity. I mean age diversity, gender diversity, location diversity. The purpose of diversity on a board is to get the right sort of differing ideas and concepts brought together, so that the group can make a better decision than a homogeneous board, which suffers from groupthink. And that's the exact purpose for, so bring your board officers on as champions of change. And then
We just switched our executive team officers in April. And my new team is just gung-ho on this whole thing. And fortunately, I mean, because I don't know how much longer I could deal with it without like us keeping the move in that direction. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess things like the Cupid thing and just like getting out there and getting them to kind of.
Well, start with that board matrix. And just because somebody's a lawyer doesn't necessarily mean that they would only fit one category. They may be a young lawyer, so youth may be a check. They may be a female lawyer, maybe that checks. They may be from a minority community, that might be a check. So do your board matrix, figure out what you need and what you've got, and then your board needs to help. And one of the ways that you can do that is that you can put on a meet and greet. So ask each board member to invite 3 people that they think would be great board members to a meet and greet at somebody's home or something like that, so that you can acquaint people with the work of your organization and you can acquaint the board with other potential candidates. Hope that helps.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And I will I want to remind everybody that, we have the Cause Cupid event next week, but we also are going to be, doing a whole new offering on Cause Cupid around board development. And so again, if you haven't signed up to our newsletter, please do. We'll follow up with you after this, but we've got some really phenomenal things that we'll be doing that will be helping with board development. So there's another question that Glenn had put into chat, Mitch, and it is, any special considerations when the audit and finance committees include outside non-board member participants?
Oh, excellent question. The law says, the California Corporation Code says that if any committee of the board has the authority to act on behalf of the board as a whole, it must be comprised of all board members. The one exception to that in the law is the audit committee, and you can bring in outside expertise to the audit committee. It's the only place that it allows committees with authority of the board to have outside resources come in.
Great.
Does that help? Does that answer the question?
That definitely answers the question. Plus, it's always good to have other folks besides board members on those committees. It's helpful.
Yeah, but you can't if, for example, your program committee is making decisions on behalf of the full board, that can only be directors. You can't have volunteers or staff members on it. But audit committee, you can. And if the committee does not speak for the board, if it cannot make its own policies without going to the full board for approval, then you can have non-members, non-directors on those committees. But then you have to take all your recommendations to the full board.
Right, really important. So we have a few minutes left. Any other last burning questions from anyone before we let Mitch go and let you guys go for the rest of the day? I don't see any hands. And I just want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. We're good? Okay, cool. Mitch, anything else? Any last burning advice you want to give anybody? Any last?
No, the only thing that I want to say is I think that most of the good things in our society today come through nonprofit organizations. It is really a critical part of society as we know it. And it's critical that nonprofits have the right sort of smart, active, and generous board members to help them carry out these functions. There's a guy in the Senate by the name of Charles Grassley from Iowa. And basically what he said at one point was, I cannot envision American society without nonprofits. And I sure don't want to. And he's right. None of us wants to think about what our communities would be like if we didn't have a lot of nonprofits. I'm from Pasadena. I live in Pasadena. There are roughly 2,000 nonprofits in Pasadena. And what we have as a community is largely determined by these wonderful nonprofits. So I thank you all for being involved with the nonprofit community, whether as a staff member or a board member or a donor or whatever. I thank you and I congratulate you for helping us build a better country.
And I second that very much. And again, Mitch, you were awesome. Thank you so much for this. Everybody look out for more, because on January 19th, Mitch is leading another one of our series, and it's going to be, what is it? It's what I learned in 20 years as CEO, right?
Yeah, the title is actually, it says, What I Wish I Knew Then.
Yeah.
and it's lessons learned over 20 years in the CEO hot seat.
So if you guys want to put that on your calendar, we'll be in January, and we will again send out more emails about it. And with that, I'm going to end our recording, and thank you so much, Mitch.